From the Free Press, this is Honestly, and I'm Barry Weiss. Over the past year, right-wing parties across the West have been sweeping elections. Donald Trump, of course, but also Argentina's Javier Milei, Italy's Giorgia Meloni, El Salvador's Nayib Bukele, and now Germany. On Sunday, 83% of Germans went out to the polls, the highest turnout since the Cold War. The Christian Democrats, the country's center-right party led by Friedrich Merz, won. But that's not the big story. The big story is that the right-wing populist party, the AfD, came in second with nearly 21% of the vote, its strongest showing since World War II. There is a single reason why. It's not the economy, it's not the war with Russia, it's not climate change, it's immigration, full stop. And I'm not talking about jobs or wage deflation. I'm talking about the fact that over the past decade, Germany has seen a net migration of 5 million people, more than 1 million of these new arrivals coming from Syria and Afghanistan. The social tension, even calling it that feels like an understatement, has been palpable. And here I'm choosing just two examples from last week. One in which an Afghan migrant is alleged to have rammed a car through a crowd of people, injuring 39, including several children.
A car has rammed into a group of people in the southern German city of Munich. A 24-year-old Afghan national has been arrested at the scene. It's understood to have been a deliberate attack, and part of the investigating team now is the Office of Extremism.
Or just the day before the election, in which a Syrian migrant became the lead suspect for a stabbing just outside of the Holocaust Museum.
Police have revealed that the suspect, a Syrian refugee, admitted to attacking the victim out of hatred for Jews.
All of this has fundamentally tested the limits of immigration, assimilation, and multiculturalism. And the dynamic here is not unique to Germany. It's characterized so many Western nations, in which the center-left and the left have ignored the problem because it's politically incorrect, and the right has named it, therefore filling the power vacuum. Michael Sandel has put it perfectly. Fundamentalists rush in where liberals fear to tread. If there's a line that captures the politics of our era, it might be that. Last week, the urgent question of whether or not certain migrants can adopt Western ideals was called into question in Australia after two nurses in Sydney went viral after they were caught on camera saying they would kill Israeli patients that came into their hospitals.
Let's say an Israeli, God forbid.
I won't treat them. I'll kill them.
You'll kill them? So if an Israeli is in Australia and God forbid something happened to him and he comes to your hospital, would you kill him?
You have no idea how many Israeli Khara dog came to this hospital and I sent it to Jahannam.
One nurse was an Afghan refugee. Here to unpack it all is Free Press columnist Batya Ungar-Sargon, Democratic fundraising powerhouse Brianna Wu, and the founder of Quillette, a must-read publication based out of Australia, Claire Lehman. Stay with us. Batya, Brianna, and Claire, welcome to Honestly.
Thank you, Barry.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, so over the weekend, Germans went to the polls and Friedrich Merz of the Christian Democrats secured enough votes to become the next chancellor. But what was more interesting, and what everyone who's interested in European politics was watching, was how the AfD party would perform. And they ended up coming in second with almost 21% of the votes. So let's start with a really simple question. And Claire, maybe let's start with you. What did voters see in these two parties? Why is it that the center-left, the party of Angela Merkel, seems like a dead letter, and these are the parties that are rising?
Well, I think you alluded to it in your introduction, Barry. Immigration is, of course, the number one issue for many voters, and particularly young voters. So you can see in the statistics post-election that many young people not only voted for the AfD, but also the far left party. Now, this actually dovetails with the fact that Germany has been in recession. I think this is going to be the third year in which their economy will not grow, and that's partly due to their shutting down of nuclear plants and their economic model no longer working, the model where they import cheap gas from Russia and import cheap industrial inputs from China. So if you put these two things together, if you put in economic contraction with mass migration, it's a recipe for disaster. And I think we shouldn't be surprised that we're seeing young people increasingly disaffected. And it's not an issue that is limited to Germany. We're facing it in countries all around the globe for similar reasons.
Batya, what do you think the significance is of these two right-wing parties, one of them center-right, one of them right-wing populist, coming to power in Germany?
I think the big question and the big problem that a lot of us are dealing with when it comes to the AfD is this question of, Nazism, right? Home of Nazism, birthplace of Nazism, Germany, and now we have a quote-unquote far-right party that seems to be gaining steam, gaining popularity for the first time since the Holocaust, since World War II. Here's the argument that I would make. It's very clear right now that the Western world is doing a rethink of the kind of post-war internationalist order in which we have no boundaries and no nation states. We have, the mass movement of trade and goods and people across borders. And we're all going to move slowly into this sort of, imagine there are no nations, liberal world order where we're all sort of on board with this multiculturalism stuff. And it's clear that everyone, everywhere is turning on this idea. We had a massive, massive repudiation of that here with Donald Trump. Obviously, Brexit was a big repudiation of that. You're seeing the rise of nationalism and the view that we owe something to our co-citizens, to our neighbors, that we do not owe to people across the world. This is now in resurgence. I very much believe that. I think it's a really important movement because we abandoned and forgot and displaced our neighbors in favor of people across the world. I think that there is something really immoral about that, despite the fact that I myself was one of the people championing this. We're seeing how what ended up happening was we got rich and our neighbors got poor as a result of this. And there's something really deplorable about it. Now, it seems to me that it cannot be the case that we say everyone is allowed to arrive at this realization except for Germany. Because the thing, of course, that made the Nazis was not that they were nationalists. It's not that they were patriots. It's not that they cared about each other. It's that they believed in eradicating the Jews from the face of the planet and committed mass murder of everybody that they encountered who they didn't like and didn't agree with. I mean, mass murder of Soviets, right? It wasn't just the Jews. So I think we really have to be careful not to say anything that smacks of nationalism that we are now embracing that comes from Germany is ipso facto verboten. And the proof is in the pudding. I mean, the AfD is unbelievably pro-Israel, like most of these new emergent nationalisms. And I think, I'm not saying that as a Jew because I think everyone needs to be pro-Israel. I happen to think, being pro-Israel is, the right position, but I admire and respect a lot of people who are not. It's just that it is the proof of the pudding. Like, if you're Nazis, but you love Jews and you love Israel, you're not Nazis, right? Like it's kind of like a proof that we're not actually repeating history. So I think that's kind of what's happening here.
I think the other thing that's confusing is that the leader of the party, Alice Weidel, is gay, is married to a woman of Sri Lankan descent, which doesn't usually accord with the way we think about Nazis. But I feel confused because this guy, Joseph Schuster, the head of the largest German Jewish organization, said this about the vote. It must concern us all that a fifth of German voters are giving their vote to a party that is at least partly right-wing extremist and that openly seeks linguistics and ideological links to right-wing radicalism and neo-Nazism, and that plays on people's fears. This is one of those things. So I'll give an example that maybe will back us into this question. From here, you read about reform and you read about Nigel Farage, and you really have a sense, if you're getting your information from the legacy press, which on some topics it's kind of hard to avoid, that they're totally outside of the Overton window, that they're, racist, bigoted, like all of the basket of deplorables is reform and Farage. And then you go to the UK, and we were in London last week, and I was absolutely struck by the number of totally sober, totally within the mainstream kind of center-right position who were drawn to reform simply because, as Batya, you were saying, the proof is in the pudding. Like, they've looked at the Tory legacy of the past 15 years and are like, this isn't working. So what is it with AFD? You know, anyone, please feel free to weigh in here. Is this like a case where we've all just been like wildly misinformed? Or, you know, was Jamie Kirchick, our, you know, friend of the Free Press, right in making the argument in the New York Times that they have ties to Nazi groups, they have people that are affiliated with the party that are genuinely beyond the pale?
I mean, I think Wall Street Journal had a really great piece this week talking, you know, just reminding us that AFD is not a friend of America, you know, bringing out a lot of the anti-American stuff they've been saying, you know, despite the fact that J.D. Vance is going to come, like, say some very kind things about them. I think, you know, the really key thing here, Barry, is we've got to wrestle with the fact that unchecked immigration changes a culture and pushes it towards the right. Like, for me, very selfishly, I want a orderly immigration process, because it seems that when this is completely unchecked, like, you have politicians elected that are tremendously hostile to my rights. You know, Angela Merkel was responsible for 1 million immigrants coming into Germany, which really changed the culture of the place. That would be the equivalent of 4 million people here. And you had things that happened. Like, there was an incident of unofficial, Sharia law police going around one German town in a really famous, I believe it was a 2014 incident. Yeah, you have these famous incidents, these parallel legal systems being set up in Germany for family disputes to be adjudicated by Sharia law, and basically a parallel legal system. This is fundamentally an anti-democratic effort here. And it seems to me like I am very pro-immigration. At the same time, you've got to bring the right people into the country. And the key part is you've got to have a system to basically check them and to integrate them into the society. This is the problem here. It's not that you can't have a positive immigration system or do the right thing for refugees, as, you know, this Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia is destabilizing the Middle East. We can have policies for that, but you also have to be realistic and understand it is going to undermine democracy and the country if you just bring people in without a plan to make them believe in the democratic systems. So I think AFD is the most obvious reaction to this possible. And it is a clarion warning call for the rest of us. Just one more thing, because I know I've talked for a while. I had a dinner at Abigail Schreier's house a few months ago, and Brett Weinstein was there, and Constantine was there from Trigonometry, and we had the most realistic, just saying what we really thought about immigration there. And Constantine said something to me I think about every single day. He said that there was not enough time to save the culture of Europe and the democracy of Europe, but we still had time here in the United States if we took it seriously. I think that's very true. And I think we either take this issue, really get through to Democrats, we need an answer on this, or I think that we are going to increasingly put far-right candidates in office.
So I want to push back a little bit on that, Brianna, and then I want to hear what Claire's saying about this. I really reject the cultural argument against immigration here. And I think it's because the majority of our immigrants, especially the illegal ones, come from Central and South America, who are culturally very similar to us. They're fleeing an unbelievably corrupt country. They want rule and order. I mean, we all probably have friends either who are Hispanic themselves, who are migrants themselves, or who are, you know, people who are the children of them, grandchildren of them. The culture they come from is very, very, very similar to ours. I have no problem. I mean, most of these people would make fine neighbors, would make lovely neighbors. A lot of my neighbors are immigrants. To me, it is about the dilution of the economic power of the American worker, and then the smearing of them as racist, and the weaponization of race to erase the distinction between citizen and non-citizen. It's about the idea that citizenship has to mean something. The nation state has to exist. You have no rights and I have no rights if we don't have a border. because our rights stem from a compact we make with a government as a body politic. There has to be limits to that. That has to mean something spiritual, economic, social, and political. And so I really I can't stand when Europeans lecture us about this, because I think it's so different. In Europe, I totally think the cultural thing is big because their police are too cowardly to actually police these Muslim migrants. We don't have that problem, thank God. We got the NYPD. They're not scared of anybody. So we just don't have the same immigration issue. We're struggling with immigration, but our conversation is so totally, totally different. And even the Muslim migrants who come here, immigrants who come here, are totally bought into the I live in a neighborhood that's 50% Muslim. We just do not have that. You walk into any cafe on Emmons Avenue and you'll see, women and their mothers. And in one family, the girl is wearing a hijab and the mother is not. In the next family, the mother's wearing hijab and the girl is not. I mean, these are Americans who are they experience their Muslim religion as Americans. And so I feel like it's just a very, very different scenario.
One of the things, guys, that's just kind of amazing to think back to is do you remember in 2015 where Angela Merkel gave that famous speech where she talked about, I don't know how to say it in German, but she said, "We will cope." And that was the time, of course, when the image sort of emblazoned on all of our minds and hearts was of that young Syrian child that had washed up on the beach. And I was someone at the time who was super pro-Merkel. I felt like Germany, of all places, is obligated because of its history. I can't even believe I'm saying this now, to welcome in. I really felt that way. And that it was the moral and correct thing to do. I know Batya felt the same way. She was probably even more to my left. Right. What happened in the course of a decade, Claire, that, have you sort of had your own political trajectory on the question of immigration, or back then, were you already alive to how foolish this Merkel policy was going to be?
No, I was definitely a Merkel skeptic, and I think that skepticism has borne out. I think when we talk about migration, it's a complicated issue that often gets oversimplified. So in Australia, we have a very good system of high-skilled migration. So most people who come here have university degrees, and something like 40% of Australians are either foreign-born themselves or have a parent that's foreign-born. I think we have the highest per capita immigration system in the world at the moment. That being said, there's the issue is the volume and the cadence of migration. So we've had something like a city the size of Adelaide of people come in just since COVID. So it's putting strain on infrastructure. It's putting strain on rental prices. People can't get houses. So the issue is which migrants are coming and how fast can you absorb them and how quickly can they assimilate. Now, the problem with Europe is that they had no high-skilled immigration program. It was low-skilled. It was 1 million refugees who couldn't speak English, who had no qualifications, who had no you couldn't tell if they were going to be able to contribute to the economy. They all came in at once. And it's not a surprise that enclaves and ghettos have emerged because of it, because European nations have a very robust welfare system, much like Australia. Now, the one reason why America's experience with migrants is different is because you guys force people to adapt. You don't have ghettos and enclaves where people can go on welfare and can bring out their parents and can bring out their extended families and know that their healthcare is going to be looked after and know that you can get basically on welfare for your entire life. So there are different conditions that give rise to assimilation and which don't. And I think that's the difference between Europe's experience, Australia's experience, and America's experience. So you have to focus on high-skilled immigration. And if you're not going to have high-skilled immigration, you can't really have a welfare state.
One thing I've been thinking about a lot, and I'm sure at some point I'll find a better way to articulate this, but I'll do my best with you guys and maybe you'll help me out. It's really this sense I have watching the politics play out in many of the countries I mentioned at the top of the show, and certainly here in America, and this is true politically as well as culturally, is that people want the strong version of the argument. They are like repulsed by a politics that does not represent the stronger version of the argument. So even though Kemi Badenoch, who's currently the head of the Tory party, and Nigel Farage are largely in sync with their views, people are, even though I think that Kemi is a much better retail politician, much more charismatic, much younger, a lot of the young people who are center-right, right, that we were talking to throughout London are much more drawn to him. How do we, Claire, like, do you see that same pattern that I do? Because I see the same thing with Germany. I see the same thing here at home. How do we get out of that? Or is that just sort of the fate of politics in the West for the next decade or so?
I think it's got a lot to do with how suppressed this issue in particular has been for the last decade. So centre-left politicians and centre-left or just centrist media institutions have avoided the topic of immigration because anyone who spoke about immigration was immediately branded racist. And we're sort of being dragged out of that now because of all of the political volatility and all of the election results that have happened. But people are really reacting because they feel like they feel like their democratic right to have a say on this issue has been suppressed, and there is no national conversation about it. And so I think that is driving the reaction that we're seeing. But if we see more centrist politicians, centre-left politicians actually addressing this issue honestly and addressing people's concerns, I think the situation will change again. I mean, a key example is in Denmark, the centre-left party have a pretty strict immigration policy and program. I think they're even sending people back. So, immigrants who are, not assimilating or who have committed crimes, I think they're deporting some of them. And that has neutralized any kind of populist insurgency that they would otherwise have.
In my view, if you're looking at the right since the beginning of November, you've won the White House, you've won Congress, you control the court, you're the wealthiest, most powerful, arguably, man in the world, controls the most important social media platform in the world and has the ear of the president. I would say, are you tired of all this winning? You're winning. And yet many of the people that are most influential inside the MAGA movement are not acting like people who have won. In other words, rather than taking the moment and graciously welcome in newcomers, they're, in my view, repelling those people by doing things like, ironically, Nazi saluting, which is what we just saw at CPAC with Steve Bannon and then this Mexican actor whose name escapes me. Now, of course, when Elon Musk first did it, I think it was on Inauguration Day, it came alongside him saying, "My heart goes out to you," and everyone kind of gave him a pass. I certainly did. I did not think it was a Nazi salute. And yet now we have this kind of mimetic, imitative, are they doing Nazi salutes ironically? Like, what's going on here? And the way I'm understanding it is not that they are sincere in their Hitlerian worldview. I do not think Rachel Maddow and Joyanne Reid have been right for the past decade. But I think that they are still acting like online trolls that have no power, when in fact they have a lot of power. And I find this to be a kind of interesting phenomenon because I think it's one that you could look at as a mirror image of some of what's happened on the far left over the past while. Batya, I know you saw Steve Bannon at CPAC after he made that salute, and I'm wondering what you make of it, both him and the phenomenon more broadly.
Well, I can tell you just on the Steve Bannon front, his response was not a salute, the same wave I do to the War Room Posse after my motivational speeches, which I've seen him do. He said, he sent me another picture of him doing it 7 years ago. It's not a Nazi salute. That's not how he meant it. And then he said that I could also convey the message that the French politician that waved off and refused to appear at CPAC, he is a pussy, too weak to govern France. Sorry, Ima. I try not to swear publicly, but so in his mind, he was not.
He's talking there. It's important to clarify. He's not talking there about like a Green Party member. He's talking about Jordan Bardella, who is the head of Le Pen's party in France.
Right. So,
like, not exactly a squish.
Well, compared to Steve Bannon's standards, it turns out he is. I would push back on that, Barry. I would say, first, Brianna, I think the reason the Democrats are scrambling to find messaging on minorities and LGBT issues is because nobody believes that Trump actually poses a threat to these people. And I think that that's what they've spent the last year and the last month and 2 months and 3 months really proving. Trump is a centrist. He is not an extremist. If you look just at the policy on every issue, he represents where the vast majority of Americans are at, whether it's the war in Ukraine, whether, don't want to fund it. Israel, want to support it. Immigration, want much less of it. Like health, want much more of it. Like on every issue, he is where they are. This is a person who appointed the highest ranking out gay in American history, Scott Bessent, to Treasury. It's just falling flat because the perceived threat from the other side is no longer a compelling one because it was a media invention. And Barry, I think, maybe to somebody who's not being impacted as directly by all of this stuff, it seems like the online trolls are still online trolling. The online trolls are still online trolling. That's not the MAGA movement. If you look at what Donald Trump has accomplished in 3-4 weeks, I mean, it's astonishing. And the moderation and the popularity of it inherently involved welcoming in Tulsi Gabbard, Democratic presidential candidate. RFK Jr., still a liberal as far as I can tell on pretty much everything, including abortion. Pete Hegseth, they just announced that they are radically shrinking the Pentagon. I mean, it's so funny because the left was trying to troll Trump and say, you want to make cuts, why don't you start with the military-industrial complex? And Trump was like, good point. Why don't we do that? Let's fire thousands of people there. He is outgunning the left. He's outflanking them to the left on every single issue. This is what winning looks like. And yeah, I am getting sick of it. I'm getting sick of the feeling of like, one feels jubilant, not just because this is exactly what he was elected to do, but because he is totally nailing it on so many issues, maintaining that dead center that the American people elected him to do. And I think, again, I am volunteering to come to any of these emergency meetings and explain to Democrats like the pathway back to the White House is where you were in the 90s, because that's where Trump is now.
Batya, supporting or switching sides on Ukraine and effectively teaming up with a dictator who has genocidal intentions in Ukraine is not centrist. And I don't think the American people voted for dictatorship support. And if they did, they weren't paying attention.
That's not how we talk about our neighbors. We don't think of them as being uninformed or voting for the wrong thing. That is 100% what they voted for. It is what hundreds of working class people on both parties told me they wanted. They do not understand why we are funding this war, why this is our business, why this is our fight. And that is exactly what they voted for. And it's not even just Republicans. This is a very, very unpopular issue with American voters. You may not like that. You may not like them for that. But this is why Donald Trump won, because he said, oh, this is what you want. This is what I'm going to do because I'm a public servant and my job is to do what you want, not to judge you for not having the right politics.
I think it's a fair point that Biden was not able to make the case for Ukraine because, again, we have not had a president in the public eye for 4 years before Trump. So I think I will be very generous and say I think that's a fair point that the American people don't understand that. But I don't think they're fans of Vladimir Putin. I think most Americans understand Putin is a murderous dictator and is a terrible guy. And I think it's pretty disturbing to a lot of people to see our president like glazing for one of the worst people in the entire world. I'm old enough to remember like Ronald Reagan, the 80s, the evil empire, no further Mr. Gorbachev. And now we've got a president that is just 100% endorsing, like literally reversing the order of the victim and the oppressor here, like saying, Ukraine is the one that started the war. It's crazy town.
But But isn't there a difference between what I think a lot of people on the right and in the MAGA base believe, which is, look at the way our communities have been decimated here at home. We can't afford a decent life. Why are we sending hundreds of billions of dollars to a war far away? And what the president has done over the past few days, which is offer I'll be generous, totally revisionist view of the past few years. Like, I don't think that most Americans, even if they believe that we shouldn't be as deep in that war, that perhaps we shouldn't be funding it, that Europeans, and I agree with this, should step up further for their defense. You can believe all of that, but be appalled at the idea that an American president would be basically repeating the propaganda lines of Putin and acting as if the smaller nation that was invaded somehow deserved to be invaded from an imperialist power. That's, I think, what people are outraged by.
Well, it depends when you say outraged, people are outraged. What I would say is a few things. The first is the American people didn't elect Donald Trump to be a historian of this war. They elected him to stop it and to put an end to it. And as far as I can tell, he has a very clear strategy for doing that.
I don't think he does. I honestly don't think he does. We're looking at NATO troops, British troops and French troops now being deployed to Ukraine. Article 5 of the NATO alliance means that an attack on French or British troops drags the US into war. What may happen is an escalation into World War III, the counterfactual to sending more aid to Ukraine so that Ukraine people can fight their own war is dragging Europe into war with Russia. And now we know how that turns out because that happened in World War II. So I think this simplistic idea that we just switch off the aid to Ukraine and suddenly the war ends is very naive.
That's not what I was going to say was Donald Trump's plan for ending the war in Ukraine. But I mean, if you think that Donald Trump is going to deploy American troops,
She didn't say that.
Russia, he's not.
She didn't say
that. I didn't say that. I said British and French troops will be deployed. If the Russians
shoot on them, then America will have to join the war. That's what you said.
Well, that's what the NATO agreement is about.
And I'm telling you, Donald Trump's going to honor that. I have a bridge to tell you. Here's what Trump is trying to do. First of all, I think he came into this with a sense that when he met with Zelensky would be unbelievably grateful for the $200 billion in American taxpayer dollars that he was given to wage this war and to hang on as long as he did, and would be very willing to end the war and stop the bloodshed. 1 million men are dead, many of them Zelensky's own people. I think Trump was rather shocked and horrified when Zelensky not only seemed reluctant to come to the table to put an end to the war, but then gave him a hard time about this deal with the rare minerals where the Americans would recuperate some of that aid back. And I think he got very angry at that because, of course, it is extremely angering to be told that after the immense generosity that America has shown to Ukraine. And as a result of that, he has been talking about Zelensky in a way that he feels represents how he feels about it. Now, the strategy here is Donald Trump is not a liberal. Liberals believe that diplomacy has to happen between equals. And so when you have a situation like the Palestinians and the Israelis, let's say, and the Palestinians have much less power, the Obama-Biden doctrine, the liberal democratic doctrine is, well, you must give power to the weaker person and weaken the stronger person, get them to some sort of even playing field, and then you can have a deal between equals. Of course, it's nonsense. It never works, and it never worked because equals have absolutely no incentive to come to the table because they're equals. Why would they're in equal footing? The weaker party knows that they're going to keep getting supported by the empirical power, whatever, and the stronger party feels like they're about to get weakened. Why would they come to the table? Donald Trump is a real estate magnate. He sees it totally differently. The way you get to a negotiation, the way you get to a really good agreement is you need a power imbalance. You need one person who has no power, who is much weaker, who has massive incentive to come to the table, and another party that has a lot of power and will be guaranteed to keep that power. And that way, both people have incentives to come to the table. And I think that he is actually playing Putin like a fiddle. He knows that Putin, who has endless cannon fodder and nuclear weapons, has absolutely zero incentive to come to the table. And Ukraine, now that they have, they have been promised by the Biden administration endless American support, well, they didn't want to come to the table when they were losing, and they also didn't want to come to the table when they were winning. And what Trump did was he showed up and said, look, there's a power imbalance here. We've been propping up the weaker side and alienating the stronger side. And what I need to do is say to Putin, that very reason that you had for going in the first place, NATO expansion, is not going to happen. So come to the table. Let's put an end to this war, because Donald Trump, he truly hates war. He truly thinks that it is a total waste. And I think that's what he's doing here by building up Putin. And then by, I think actually he's genuinely angry at Zelensky at this point, who screamed at Scott Bessent over this rare minerals deal.
Look, I'm not going to denigrate Trump's negotiating abilities, and it's early days in the negotiations. However, this idea that it stops at half of Ukraine or the land that Russia has already gained in Ukraine is fanciful. Have we forgotten Have we forgotten the USSR? Have we forgotten why NATO was established in the first place? Half of Eastern Europe was under Soviet control not that long ago. Putin is not going to stop until Ukraine is wiped off the map. This attitude reminds me of the left-wingers who think that Hamas will be placated if you just give a little bit of land of Israel to the Palestinians. There's a denial of genocidal intent. Obviously, Hamas want to wipe Israel off the map. They want to kill every last Jew who is alive. When it comes to Putin, he wants Ukraine to be wiped off the map. If Trump goes to him and says, you can keep the land that you've captured in your war efforts, that's not necessarily going to be enough for Putin.
So Claire, how do you think this ends? Like what? How do you think this actually ends? With you're fighting a superpower with nuclear power and endless cannon fodder. How do you think the war ends? It's interesting to me.
Well, I don't think Trump is wrong on everything. I do think the Europeans have a huge responsibility, and they've shirked their responsibility to build up their own militaries to deter Russia. And I think that's actually a huge failure of Merkel in particular, of Germany. Obviously, European nations have to commit more to defence spending. They have to go beyond 2% of their GDP, and they need to get together to resist Russian aggression. But I do think it is naive to believe that this war will end with these negotiation talks. I think
so. How do you think it will end? You think that they're going to expel Russia from Crimea and the Donbass with what, French troops? That's how you think this should end, really?
I'm not going to predict how it will end.
No, I just need an alternative to Trump's. What's an alternative?
Putin needs to be given a bloody nose, and the Europeans need to do it. I just don't think the deal that is going to miraculously occur is going to end the aggression. And
so French troops on the ground. If
Putin is not deterred,
okay, how? Deterred how?
I can answer this. One of my really big complaints with Biden is he has not gotten really serious about helping Ukraine win this war. Russia does this thing constantly. They're like, oh, we're going to have World War III. Don't you dare do that, United States. We're going to have World War III. And they just make us back down, back down, back down. This is exactly what happened with Obama when they invaded Crimea. And for the last 4 years, Zelensky's been out here saying, look, give us American jets, give us air support, help us really get out here and win this war, give us the weapons we need, let's really do it. Don't forget that, I know your good friend Batya, Elon Musk, he shut down Starlink, so they didn't even have intelligence being sent into there, which had massive consequences for our intel operations there. So I say, if you really want Donald Trump to be a president that Americans look back on and go, wow, that was a fantastic guy, how about he gets in there and does the job that Biden wouldn't? Give them the actual weapons to win the war, build some international support. Don't count on Europe to do this. Let's see some real leadership. Biden just was flat out too weak to do this. I want to see it.
One of the reasons that we wanted to have Claire on this show is not just because we read everything she writes, but because she's been reporting on a story that I would argue is maybe one of the most disturbing things I have seen since October 7th, 2023. I could tell it, but Claire, I'd rather you do it. Tell us about this video that went viral with these two nurses at a Sydney hospital.
Yes, so there was a video that went viral, as you said, Barry, of two nurses who were apparently killing time on their night shift, and they were on some kind of social media app where you randomly are presented with people. You scroll through. Anyway, they happened to come face to face with an Israeli influencer who started videoing the conversation. And when these nurses learned that this influencer was an Israeli, they told him that he would soon die. And then this influencer asked them, what do you guys do if you're presented with an Israeli patient? And then that's what these atrocious comments occurred. They said that they would not treat them, they would actually kill them. The male nurse, Rashad Nadir, bragged about apparently already killing Israeli patients. And so this was deeply shocking to Australians. And I wrote a column for the Australian newspaper about it because we're a very high trust nation. When we go to the hospital, we don't have to worry about the political views of the people who are treating us. We don't have to worry about their religion. No one ever even thinks about it. You wake up in the emergency department after being hit by a car. Not only do you not have to worry about paying a bill, but you're not concerned about who's treating you, right? And so this tears at the social fabric of Australia. And I saw it in the faces of the bureaucrats on the day that this bombshell news happened. The health secretary was in tears. She said never in her wildest dreams did she think she would have to stand in front of the media and say that and apologise for nurses threatening to kill people. And our New South Wales health minister was visibly angry because these nurses were wearing the uniform of New South Wales Health. It's a government uniform. We pay high taxes here in Australia for our health care, for public services. So, these health bureaucrats were visibly upset and visibly angry. And it was only 1 week later when all of this occurred that about 50 Muslim groups and leaders put together a communique saying that these nurses had been humiliated enough and that anti-Semitism was being weaponized to demonize the Muslim community. Now, the fact that so many groups came together and co-signed this statement about weaponized anti-Semitism in response to nurses threatening to kill patients in the Australian healthcare system was outrageous and shocking. And a friend of mine, Drew Pavlov, has been saying on social media that this is like a Chernobyl for Australia's multicultural society. It's, we're a small nation. We don't have, we're a nation that comes together. We have more of a collective culture than what you guys do in the United States. And so when this just tears at the fabric where we sort of operate in our day-to-day lives just thinking that, we live in this harmonious, egalitarian nation, just thinking that these nurses might be the tip of the iceberg has been really confronting for a lot of people.
I wonder if you were surprised. I'm not surprised that Australian bureaucrats, politicians who maybe are out of touch are surprised. But for those of us who follow news of anti-Semitism closely, Australia has been arguably one of the worst atmospheres, societies when it's come to anti-Semitism. We recently ran a piece by a guy called Alex Rivchin whose home, or whose former home, I forget all the details, there was like an attempted firebombing. And the kinds of notes I get from readers in Australia who are, it's shock. I mean, I've sort of like stopped being shocked, and yet I'm still shocked at what I'm seeing. And here, I think probably the most famous example is what's gone on at UCSF. But hospitals, medical schools, they have not been immune from this virus. And, Claire, you've just been reporting on Australian society for so long. Were you surprised when you saw the video?
Yeah, I was still shocked by the virulence and the fact that these nurses said it on camera in their uniforms. I found that confronting, but it did suggest to me that they've said it before, and they probably casually say such things in their homes, away from cameras. One reason why we've got this problem in Australia at the moment is because we've got a complete vacuum of leadership on the issue. So at the moment, our Prime Minister is part of the Australian Labor Party. The federal government is an ALP government at the moment, and they are reliant on some marginal seats in Western Sydney where Muslim voters comprise a big chunk of the voting bloc. And so they're very hesitant to alienate any of those voters. And so they've thrown Israel under the bus, and they're really timid to call out anti-Semitism. And as we know, when you don't call this hatred out, it festers, it grows, the problem starts to snowball. And so we've had this vacuum of leadership at the federal level. And I think, ever since the people on the steps of the Sydney Opera House, that happened 2 days after the October 7th massacre. Ever since people were there chanting, "Where's the Jews? Fuck the Jews," we've had a lack of leadership. It should have been stamped out then. The Prime Minister should have said all of those people are to be investigated, arrested. If they're not citizens, they're to be sent back home. There should have been a really hard line drawn right then from the beginning. But because they didn't do that, because no one was arrested, the only person arrested after that protest was someone waving an Israeli flag. The only person arrested, because it's been able to fester, and there has been this lack of
presumably for sort of upsetting community relations or provocation.
Yeah,
right? This is the dynamic we see happening in country after country.
Yeah, and it's not just the Prime Minister, it's like the New South Wales Police Commissioner. They just haven't taken it seriously enough. There's been a denial, I think, of the problem, and so it's just been allowed to sort of accelerate.
How are normal Australians, you're so far away, like what are people talking about this story? It was such a huge thing in the Jewish world, and then of course, and we'll get to this topic in a minute, it was overtaken by the horrific events of what happened in Gaza with the Bebish children on Friday. But were normal Australians talking about this story?
Oh, absolutely. Everyone was talking about it. Everyone was shocked. It was all over the media. And what's really sad is, even before this story broke, is that some of my Jewish friends and Jewish families that I know are even talking about leaving. They're putting together plans for, like, what are we going to do if this gets worse? And it's the first time people have had to think like this. These are people born here in Australia. But if they're going to be targeted because of their religious views, they're now making plans to leave, which I think is absolutely devastating. I've never in my life have I seen a minority group treated this way, and subject to so much terrorism, basically. And that's what we're looking at now. It's domestic terrorism. There was a caravan of explosives intercepted by police that was meant for a synagogue here in Sydney. We've had one synagogue in Melbourne firebombed. We've even had a daycare centre firebombed. Throughout the month of January, every day we would wake up and there would be cars torched in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, which is where the majority of our Jewish population live in Sydney. So it is getting to a point where people are making plans to leave, and I just find that absolutely devastating. And I've never seen anything like it in Australia.
Watching that video, there's so many things that you sort of read about in history that you understand intellectually, but you don't really understand on an emotional or visceral level. And for me, that's been a huge part of the experience of the past year and a half or so of like, am I going to be having to go to a Jewish hospital in the way that my great-grandparents did? Because, in their case, it was because of quotas, but in mine, perhaps it's because, a nurse might feel this way about my family. One of the things that I feel has been just shaken out of me was a core belief of mine for my entire life, which was the belief in a two-state solution and the belief that the most urgent crisis facing Israel was the necessity to end the occupation. And that core belief of mine has began to be tested, of course, on October 7th, and you could argue was tested when Hamas came to power in Gaza, but I mean really tested. And then I feel like something truly and finally broke in me when I watched the spectacle of cheering Gazans with their children. I can't even talk, celebrating over these coffins of a 4-year-old and a 9-month-old baby and a woman that was supposed to be their mother but was actually a random corpse. I don't really have a smart intellectual question here to ask all of you. I guess I saw Batya on Friday morning for a coffee, and kind of before we had said anything, we just burst into tears because what do you even say about it? I guess the political question to each of you is maybe how that spectacle, and if not that, how the 500 or so days that have passed since October 7th, how it's shifted your sense of what's possible and what we should be striving for or hoping for in the Middle East. Brianna, maybe let's start with you.
So, Barry, I've also had a real journey here. Like, you can look at tweets of mine from 2018 with me talking about a two-state solution very strongly. You can look at me back when I believed the progressive storyline about, Israel being the colonizers and the oppressed, and see the shift in my views. The last 2 weeks have fundamentally challenged my belief about where this can realistically go, right? There's been a real storyline that's happened in the media, and it is Israel is going too far with all of this. I've been on the front lines of saying Israel has a right to defend themselves. But now with these hostage swaps, I think a very different story is coming to fruition. And I think we're seeing what the culture of the other side really is beyond being a victim. And it's horrifying. All these things are tied together. Claire, when you put that video out, or I saw that you're reporting on those stories, that chilled me. Because for me, as just a white person, I've never even thought about the fact that a Muslim person could be so upset about Israel that they could secretly be thinking about killing their Jewish patients. And, when you see like you, Barry, those images of people cheering for infants who are strangled to death through the streets, music playing, people cheering, you have to, if you're a reasonable person, be going, what is the pathway to peace here? How do you do this? How do you get to a nation that's not going to turn around and immediately start this genocidal project to kill Israel and to destroy Israel? So is a two-state solution even possible at this point? I can sit here and give you an academic answer. You take on a generational project to de-radicalize the population. You get rid of the math books that teach children, if you have 5 Zionists and you kill 5 of them, how many Zionists do you have left? You get rid of those messages. You have somebody come in and administer Gaza and try to crack down on the corruption. You don't let Iran get more weapons in there. Sure, we could do all of that, but at some point, you've got to wrestle with these reality that you're dealing with the people that just want to destroy Israel, and their hatred of Israel is their identity. And I think it's really tough for someone who grew up with messages in the West, we're all created equal, religious freedoms, all those things are fantastic. It's the bedrock of this country. But what do you do when you have a situation with people that are fundamentally uninterested with that? I don't know.
I heard from a bunch of people at that moment, but others too. And for those, by the way, who haven't seen the videos or have sort of protected themselves from watching them, just to set the scene, at the last hostage release, this was a few days ago, Hamas created this parade-like atmosphere with music. Crowds were cheering. They locked the coffins. They also, it came out later, brought several hostages still being held in Gaza and made them watch the entire thing and then released a propaganda video out of it. it's like a level of depravity that's sort of hard to wrap your head around. And you kind of think at each moment, finally, like maybe the tiny silver lining here is people will wake up to the reality of what this group wants, but I think maybe more broadly to, a lot of the things that Sam Harris has been going on about for the past 2 decades or more, which is, all Western societies are Israel and they don't know it yet. And this is just like a fundamental civilizational threat, even if people are uncomfortable talking about it. But that moment kind of like never seems to come. And instead you have the reality that people are thinking about leaving a country like Australia. Claire, Batya, I'll just open the floor to either of you if you want to weigh in.
I mean, I was as horrified as you guys were, but I think the two-state solution died on October 7th. I mean, I'm not. I think what we've seen since just confirms that. Again, I'll just go back to the point that when you have people who have genocidal intent, you do need to adopt a strategy of deterrence. And I don't know what that looks like long term in the Middle East, but it's certainly in the short term, it means defending Israel and defending Israel's right to defend itself. And I'm very disappointed with the leaders of Australia for not supporting Israel in their existential fight against this barbaric enemy.
Batya, one thing that and maybe I will end with you here, that I'm trying really hard to hold on to right now is when you see such inhuman things, it's kind of easy to, I don't want to say lose my humanity because that sounds like some dumb pop lyric, but it's really easy to start painting a whole people with a broad brush because you're like, where is like the righteous person that is going to stand up in this crowd, and no one seems to stand up. And I wonder like how you're trying to maintain your extremely empathetic human approach to things, even when I disagree with you, how you're able to do that in this moment and in this situation.
It says in Genesis, God says to Abraham, "Ve'avarcha mevarechecha u'mekalelcha aror," which means I will bless those who bless you and I will curse those who curse you. So I will bless those who bless you. That's you, Brianna. You've had our back. And Claire, and every person who shed tears for Kfir and Ariel Bibas. We're not ever going to forget that happened. And on the cursed front, I watched that footage of the parade and I just thought, this is what it means to be cursed. A certain level of moral depravity is its own punishment. To attend a parade and cheer at a parade for the mangled, strangled, bludgeoned bodies of babies and cheer is its own punishment. To have earned the disgust of every good human is its own punishment. And I think that, the left thinks Israel is the Palestinians' misfortune, but it is the left that is their misfortune because it is the left that has perpetuated this state of absolute moral depravity for so long. And it's from this worship of weakness, this worship of abjection. They think empathy and compassion are policy. And I am so grateful to belong to a country not only that has always had and will always have the back of the Jews and stand with us against our enemies who are and have always been pure evil. The reality that we just witnessed, a culture and a society that cheered the mangled, strangled, bludgeoned bodies of babies, which again is its own punishment, is to be there. The Jews are going to be fine. America, the greatest nation on earth, has our back and always will have our back. But, that's not what we're talking about anymore. And I think that this is a really new moment.
Part of what we talked about over coffee on Friday is that very question. I grew up believing that. I think one of the great lessons of the past years is that, nothing is certain, nothing can be taken for granted. And, you have a situation where Claire's telling us that Jews in Australia are thinking about leaving Australia. Who would have imagined that 10 years ago? So while I agree that in so many ways, going back to the founders, this country has been exceptional, it's always a republic if you can keep it. It's always, will America fulfill the promises it's made to itself? I think the other huge lesson of the past years is institutions aren't magic, it's just people. And if those people don't hold fast to the ideals that have made it exceptional, we don't, who knows? So I think that is a conversation for another time, one I'd be super eager to have. I really appreciate the openness and strong views that all of you brought to this conversation. Thank you, Batya Ungar Sargon, Brianna Wu, and joining us from Australia, Claire Lehman.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Claire and Brianna.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barry.